Hello, welcome to our next session of What's Next, New Ways of Engaging Jewish Sources. We're so delighted that you could join us today. This is our third session in this series, and throughout the series, we're going to be focused on elements in the JTS universe that really are engaging sources in new and different ways. And today, actually, this is not so new and different in some ways, and it is new and different in other ways, in that we're going to be looking at a very close reading of both Tanakh and Mishnah sources and using that to show kind of the evolution of text. I'm not going to spoil anything because I can see my fabulous speakers I won't spoil, but it's going to be, kind of this interesting way of seeing how our text has evolved and changed. And I'm really delighted to showcase this. This is part of the way that teaching is done in our Summer Beit Midrash program, particularly the Nishma program, which has been a long-standing JTS program. As part of that this summer, there's also a new program that we're instituting called Tanakh 360, which will be a little bit different, but I'm excited to be able to focus on the way that we learn at our Nishma program. If you're interested in the rest of the series, we'll post that link in the chat. And thank you to all of you who've donated to support this series. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor, we have sponsors. We can have sponsors for every session. There are 3 levels at which you can sponsor. It's a great way to honor those who you've who honored loved ones, or to kind of share a simcha. There are all sorts of ways to do it. Please, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. I missed introducing myself. I'm Ellie Gettinger, Director of Outreach for the Center of Lifelong Learning at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And I'm really delighted to be with you today, even if I come off as a little bit flummoxed at the beginning here. So today we are looking at Dikduk, grammar, but not exactly grammar. And the title of our program is What's Dikduk Got to Do with It? Language, Law, and Theology. And we are joined by 2 really amazing speakers, Rabbi Luciana Pajecki, Lederman, and Miriam Meir. And in addition to their roles during the year at JTS, they are also the kind of core faculty members for the JTS Summer Beit Midrash. Rabbi Pajecki Lederman has been teaching Talmud at JTS for the past 8 years, first at Nishma, the summer program that I talked about, and also at the rabbinical school. She's originally from Sao Paulo, Brazil, and she was ordained by JTS in 2005. And she returned to work for the Brazilian community, and she was the first Brazilian female rabbi to serve that community. After her return to New York in 2011, she continued to serve Comunidade Shalom as the education consultant, scholar in residence, and High Holidays preachers until 2021. She received a master's in rabbinic literature from JTS in 2020 and is about to complete her doctorate in Talmud and education. I feel like that's
Yeah, I already did that. I forgot to update that. I did last year. It's okay.
There you go. So she's completed the JTS hat trick. She's her rabbi, she's her master's, and she has her doctorate also from JTS. Miriam Meir is the area coordinator of Jewish language and senior lecturer of Hebrew language. She's been teaching Hebrew language and literature at JTS since 2008, and she joined the faculty as a full-time member in 2011. And she's led our Hebrew language program since 2014. Her current research is on Hebrew grammar and pedagogy, teaching the language of modern Hebrew poetry as a gateway to fluency, and second language acquisition and instruction for students with language-based learning differences. She holds an MA in Jewish literature from the Jewish Theological Seminary and a BA in philosophy and life sciences from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So we will be focused today on the kind of learning that we do in the Nishma program, but we'll also be posting information about all of our summer programs in the chat. We're going to have some time for both Q&A and audience reflections. So when Luciana and Miriam ask for reflections, please share those with me and I will share them audibly with them. If you have technical questions, my colleague Tani Schwartz-Herman is available to help you with those. And you should have received an email with today's sources, but we're going to share them again in the chat. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Luciana and Miriam to get this started.
So thank you so much, Ellie. It's a pleasure to be here. I do think I recognize some names of people that I have interacted with throughout my years at JTS. So it's exciting to be learning together with you. So as Ellie said, in my role as the director of the Beit Midrash, I both teach classes, but I also work individually with students, helping them fine-tune or refine their textual skills. And Miriam also both teach, but works individually one-on-one with students to help them refine their Hebrew skills. And for a year and a half, we've been collaborating. We sat in each other's classes. I'm a teacher of text who loves Hebrew. Miriam is a teacher of Hebrew who loves text. And we're always asking, like, how can one teaching leverage the other? And we do that more intensely during the summer when Miriam comes to the Beit Midrash, and really we try to integrate the kind of Dikduk, the grammar that the students are learning, and how that can help them decode and be better readers of text and become independent readers and interpreters. So I first want to, before we dive into the learning itself, I just want to start with like two core principles that guide our work. The first, Ellie, I cannot see the slides.
We will share the slides right now.
I'm bringing them up right now. Sorry, give me 1 minute.
So I would speak, and when John Levison comes up, I would say, so the first core principle that guides our work is the principle of what we call sustained engagement. Nishma is as much about the content that we choose to talk about during a particular summer, but it's also about developing a discipline of reading text. And it's informed by this saying by Professor John Levison, who is a professor of philosophy of education. And he talks about this patient approach that it's especially necessary when reading, he talks about here Talmud, but when reading rabbinic literature, right? We tend to overall read text for the overarching message, but when it comes to rabbinic literature, and I'm sure, you know, if there are others here from other fields, other literatures, it requires a much more patient and close reading and slow reading. So that's one of the core principles that guide our work during Nishma. The second principle that is brought to us by another professor of philosophy of education, Professor Eli Hoser at Bar Ilan. Eli, if you could, or I don't know if Eli or Tani, who is the respect for the authority of the text, right? I think we all live in a culture where we are quick to jump into our reactions to what we hear. But once we enter in the Beit Midrash, we're really trying to quiet down a little bit, at least for a while, our own voices, and try to elevate the voice of the text and be respectful to the message of the text before we react to it. And that's especially important at the beginner level, when students are surrounded by dictionaries, and it can be sometimes like a tasking work, right? And it can even bear into boredom. So what I always tell my students is really what they are doing here, especially when we're dealing with the canon, with the religious texts, is really trying to listen to the best of their ability to the message that the text is trying to convey. But I want you also to picture how this is happening. So this, I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to experience a Beit Midrash. If you can put the next slide. So this happens sitting around table in conversations, right? We talk about like Jewish learning happens primarily in Chavruta, where study partners are negotiating both the space, right? And they have the responsibility of slowing each other down, right? And if someone is jumping into the next line, slowing them down and say, wait a second, did you really understand that line? But also the responsibility to mirror to each other what they understood from the text and to challenge each other. Is this really in the text, what you're saying? Or to support each other, right? And say, well, I see why you say the text says X because this word is indicative of your reading. So it's a very much a collaborative environment. But the other piece that I always like to highlight is that this whole conversation around the text, when it comes to rabbinic literature, is around the text that inside itself is having a conversation, right? Professor Beth Berkowitz at Columbia University defines rabbinic text as a text that results from a multi-dialogue, right? From a lot of voices, some of those voices more obvious than others. But one of the roles of reading is try to identify those voices. So we're going to try to go through this process and invite you into a window of how this process works and how we integrate the Hebrew learning and the text learning by learning, next slide, together with you about one particular topic that shows up in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, and that it's going to show up again in rabbinic literature. And that's the topic, the law of what we say call in Hebrew, Hashavat Aveda, the return of losses, of lost items. So as I said, since the rabbinic literature results from this multi-dialogue, one of the core voices in this dialogue, of course, is the Hebrew Bible, is the Tanakh. So we start with our impression into about the two places, the two core places, in particular in the Pentateuch, in the Torah, where this commandment, this mitzvah, shows up. Ellie, or so a lot, right? The Beit Midrash learning happens out loud. So both me and Miriam are going to model this type of learning by reading out loud to you this text, these two passages, one in Shemot, in Exodus 23:4, and the other in Dvarim, in Deuteronomy 22:1-3. And as we read, Miriam is going to read in Hebrew, and I'm going to read in English. I want you to pay attention to the differences between the two passages, between the passage in the Exodus and in Dvarim. How do they each articulate this obligation to return the lost objects? And after we're done reading, I'm going to ask you to post and send to Ellie some of your observations. So Miriam, ready?
Yeah. Okay, so we are in Shemot. כי תפגע שור אויבך או חמורו, טועה. השב תשיבנו לו.
When you encounter your enemy's ox or his ass, wandering, you must return it.
Okay, now דברים. לא תראה את שור אחיך או את שיו נידחים והתעלמת מהם. השב תשיבם לאחיך.
If you see your brother's ox or his sheep gone astray, do not ignore it. You must return them to your brother.
ואם לא קרוב אחיך אליך ולא ידעתו, ואספתו אל תוך ביתך, והיה עמך עד דרוש אחיך אותו, והשבותה לו.
If your brother is not near you or you do not know him, you shall bring it into your home, and it shall remain with you until your brother's search. Then you shall return it to him.
וכן תעשה לחמורו, וכן תעשה לשמלתו, וכן תעשה לכל אבדת אחיך אשר תאבד ממנו ומצאתה. לא תוכל להתעלם.
You shall do the same with his ass. You shall do the same with his garment. And so too shall you do with any loss of your brother. that might get lost from him, you find. You must not ignore. Okay, so I'm going to give you a few minutes to notice what is different between Exodus 23:4 and Deuteronomy 21:1-3. And Ellie, you let me know. I'm going to take notes.
So we're starting to get some answers. The first thing that people are picking up on is the enemy versus brother, which is
beautiful. Beautiful.
And then also just how much more detailed the Deuteronomy text is. And there seems to be an assumption in Shmot that you're going to return the things to your brother, but maybe that assumption doesn't exist in the other. And the difference of encounter versus see, you know, like what is the difference linguistically between those two words? So, and the sense that maybe Deuteronomy is a little more inclusive, you know, brother is that it's if you don't know him, like even that it's still someone. And one person is asking, is part of the key to a fuller understanding of the text reading, to understanding the text, understanding the cantillation as well? Also, they're noting that there's a difference now that the sheep became an ass in Deuteronomy. There's so many comments. It's people. This is
okay, but this is already a lot to work with. First of all, I love the comments, and Ellie, to the extent that if you can record for afterwards, because this is something, right? Miriam and we're always looking for new text.
I have it all for you in chat.
Wonderful. So let's start with the first.
And actually, I think this one is there's a positive in Shmot, while the other is negative. Don't ignore, as opposed to.
Oh, beautiful. Okay.
So I'll leave. I think you guys have a ton to work with.
Luciana, can I quickly address the cancellation question?
Yes, because Miriam, we were debating whether to put the cancellation or not.
Right.
And Miriam, you want to address the cancellation?
Yeah. So the cancellation marks are absolutely important. They are, you can think about it as punctuation marks. They're absolutely important for reading and understanding the text correctly. But we decided not to include them because we didn't want to make it too dense, and we really wanted to make the text as accessible as possible. So, you know, to the extent of the depth that we can go within this class, I think that the text without cantillation does the job. But,
great.
Yeah.
Beautiful. So let me first address the enemy and the oivecha, the oyev, and the ach, right? And someone already jumped into an interpretation and said, well, the ach seems more inclusive, which is a debate, right? The oivecha could mean anyone that it's not in your circle, and ach could already mean a sort of like those who are part of my tribe, even though I might not know them, but those with whom I share something. So there's a debate whether the Deuteronomy is being more inclusive, more expansive, or being more limiting in addressing the ach, right? The other, definitely, right, the expansion, right? You already, you have much more. First of all, it's not only animals, right? It expanded to other kinds of objects, inanimate objects, the simla, right? And it also creates this category of vedat achicha, right? Anything. And we can think about like why this expansion is happening here and what kinds of sociological changes might have happened to generate this change. The encounter and see, right? Especially the rabbis in the Midrash, Halacha, which we're not going to have time to study, they pick up on this difference between tifga and tir'eh, and it seems that tifga is more of a reactive. That's the way they're going to read. Like encounter is that if it comes upon you, like if it happens to you, versus a tir'eh, they hear it as a more proactive, right? So it's as being part of this expansion of the obligation, right? So the reason we wanted to start from the differences is because remember that I said that in the Beit Midrash, when we're learning rabbinic literature, there is a conversation happening around texts that themselves are conversing with each other. And we wanted to call your attention to the fact that even within the Torah, there are texts talking with each other, right? Even when they don't seem to be talking to each other, right? If we go deep into the language, we see that they are talking to each other, right? So in scholarship, it's understood that there are three major legal codes in the Bible. The first, the older one, it's called the Covenant Code, which it's assumed to have been produced around the 9th century before the Common Era. And the following code is the code that shows up in Deuteronomy, that it's called the Code of Deuteronomy, that it's assumed to have been produced in the 7th century of the Common Era. And the later one is going to be the Holiness Code that shows up in Vayikra, right? But doesn't deal with the particular issue that we're attending to here. And it's understood that Dvarim, right, Shmot, let me start from the Covenant Code, was produced at a time when the tribes of the north were coming together to form a confederation of tribes, right? And they wanted to use this sort of law, this legal principle, which it's someone, I think, used the word assumption, right? That Shmot has the assumption that you simply do it, right? It's so simple, it's so minimalist, this commandment, right? It's just, we count on individuals to fulfill it. There is no accountability. It's just it seems to be a moral principle. There is no guidance on the details of how you should go about it. So it seems to be like working as a moral principle. So you would treat the other tribes, the members of other tribes that are now part of your confederation, you would treat their property as in the same way that you treat the property of people within your tribes. You fast forward 2 centuries later, when we get to the code in Deuteronomy, this confederation of tribes already is starting to form a national identity. So that who used to be your oyer, because he's a member of the other tribe, now it's part of your national identity. So he's considered your ach, even as the second pasuk, as the second verse say, even if you don't know him personally, right? But you have more of a shared identity by the time you get to Dvarim. So not only he becomes, so your responsibility now, it's now towards everybody who is now part of a more unified whole. And that unified whole, you now owe more responsibility. It's not only a moral principle that is left to individual to figure out how to fulfill, but you get a little more detail, right? There is a little more accountability. You have to bring the object home. You have to wait until whoever your ach is come to claim it, right? So you see this expansion already happen. So we'll see that when we get to the Mishnah, when we get to the rabbinic period, right? That kind of expansion, the rabbis are not just making it up, right? They're not, in some ways, they're going to be innovative, but in some ways, they are following a thread that they already notice happening inside of the text. And I brought to you, and you're going to have in your material, a quote from Bernard Levinson, another Levinson, nothing to do with John Levinson, the educator, who actually calls Deuteronomy a hermeneutical text, right? He concludes that Deuteronomy knew the Covenant Code, right? The Covenant Code had become popular and dissipated, So they knew about it. So they wanted to create some changes, but they used a text that had already credibility, and they used the formula of those texts. And Miriam is going to talk about more about what those texts share in common. But he used that formula to expand, to paraphrase and expand. Although, so we see there is still obligation to return, but there is all those other aspects, the expansion of what is the object, the obligation to bring home if you don't find, if you don't know who the owner is. And last, which I didn't comment, which I thought it was very perceptive, the aspect that lo tuchal leitalem, right? Not only you have to return, but this extra warning you cannot ignore, right? You cannot refrain from fulfilling this obligation. So now I pass to Miriam to go back to this text and see another layer that those two texts share in common. Next slide.
We have to unmute Miriam. So hold on one second.
Allowing me to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. There you go. Sorry, Miriam.
I muted because my office is right above the subway, and so it makes a lot of noise when it goes under the tunnel here on 122nd Street. So
welcome to 3080 Broadway, everyone.
Yeah, it's a very New York office, you know. Okay, so I want to spend a little bit of time here on looking at what is common between those texts, and we included some color coding here. I hope, you know, the purple is kind of subtle, but I hope you can see this clearly. What we have highlighted here is, you know, those animals and also later items that are lost, right? That you are, and how they are characterized in this text, in both of these texts, in fact. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to ask you, I'm just going to tell you that as you can see, there are basically two linguistic devices that are helping us define exactly what it is that you are finding and are obligated to return here, right? One of them is these possessive endings that you see here. So we have the word your enemy, in Hebrew, oyivcha. And his ass is in Hebrew, chamoro. And we have the same ending in the Deuteronomy, your brother's ox, so your brother, achicha, and his sheep, seyo. Right? So the final letters here are actually possessive suffixes, which give you the, you know, possessor of this item or this animal in this case, or person, in fact, right? Your enemy is oyivcha. So that is, and chamoro, his ass. The chamor is defined by to whom it belongs, right? This is actually also goes to the difference between the two texts, right? In Dvarim, of course, the se is defined by its belonging to your ach, to your brother. In Exodus, it is defined by its belonging to your enemy. Chamoro, the definition of this animal is that it belongs to someone. Can you go to the next slide, Ellie? So I just, you know, highlighted here those endings that are basically defining things by to whom they belong. So, and on the side here on the left, you can see, you know, what it would look like. So the word ach, brother, on its own is like this. And then we have these regular endings that indicate specific people. So Achi, I did actually forget to put the English in. Achi, my brother. Achicha, your brother, masculine singular. And Achiv, his brother. And if you look at enemy, oyev, oivi is my enemy. Oivcha is your enemy. And oyevo is his enemy. Sometimes the word really changes, when we have the word garment, for example. Look at simla, that is a feminine word ending with a hey. That hey will need to turn into a taf so that we could add that ending. So we have simlati is my garment, simlatecha is your garment, simlato, his garment. Can you go to the next slide, Ellie? I said there were two devices. Another device is what we call smichut. Anyone who's learned a little bit of Hebrew knows that word, but it really is a compound noun. It's two nouns where the first noun is the main word, and the second noun does something of a descriptive role. It is, think about something in English like, a history lesson. Okay, the main thing is, of course, it's the other way around in English. The lesson is the main word, right? The history lesson is a lesson. And then history is what kind of lesson it is. So the history is a noun, but it plays a descriptive role in this compound noun, right? Orange juice, apple cake, etc. And in the same way that your enemy's ox. Okay, so this basically is the ox of, literally means the ox of your enemy, right? Or the ox of your brother. And this is going to be most important in the generation of this general category that Deuteronomy adds here, any loss of your brother. So this loss is defined by its belonging to somebody who is connected to you in a specific way. That connection is found, as we saw earlier, in the possessive ending. Nachon, your brother, your enemy, right? That is your specific connection to the owner of the item or the animal that you found. And the aveda, the lost item, is defined by its being belonging to your enemy or your brother. And I will give it back to Luciana. No, next slide. Okay, so Chaya Al-Hagelstam sums this up beautifully by pointing out exactly this. Biblical discourse suggests a stable and indissoluble bond between owner and object. A stance which implies two crucial certainties. First, that every piece of property has an owner, even that if that owner cannot be found. And second, that its ownership status is not altered even when the property is lost. We just saw how this comes across in the language itself. Next slide, please.
Okay, so we saw that there is a conversation inside of the Torah, right? Inside of the Pentateuch, but eventually we inherit this as a whole, right? And around the time it's understood that around the 2nd century BCE, this is when at least the Torah, the Pentateuch, was canonized, right? So we arrive now, we're going to switch now, we're going to move forward 4 centuries later to the 2nd century now of the Common Era, right? Once those texts have already been accepted as the canon and been sort of standardized. So the rabbis are receiving these two passages as a whole, and also this tradition of reading the past in light of the new ideologies of the moment, right? So we're going to see how that commandment that shows up on those two discrete books of the Pentateuch, they now appear in the Mishnah, which is the first sign, the first cultural production of the rabbis, the first sign that the rabbis are an organized group, even though, as Professor Seth Schwartz would say, that they don't yet have the power that eventually, the power and the influence that eventually they're going to have. But now, all of a sudden, this development that we saw from Exodus, one pasuk, one verse in Exodus, into three verses, now becomes a whole chapter in a tractate that it's called Baba Metzia, right? It's one of the tractates that deals with civil laws and with damages. And Ellie, if you could switch to we're going to focus chapter 2 of tractate Baba Metzia. It's a whole chapter with 11 paragraphs solely dealing with this mitzvah, with this commandment on how to return the lost objects. But we're going to focus only on the first two Mishnayot, the first two paragraphs of this chapter. And like we did for the Bible, we're also going to read, Miriam is going to read in Hebrew, I'm going to read in English. And I want you to notice, if you can, even though you don't have the biblical text in front of you, or you might have printed what Ellie said, what might have been the changes, right, that you notice by the time the rabbis put this forward. Miriam?
אוקיי. אלו מציאות שלו, ואלו חייב להכריז.
So the Mishnah opens with an introduction saying which found items belong to him, to the finder, and for which is the finder obligated to proclaim.
אלו מציאות שלו. מצא פירות מפוזרים, מעות מפוזרות, כריכות ברשות הרבים, ועיגולי דבלה, כיכרות של נחתום, מחרוזות של דגים, וחתיכות של בשר, וגזעי צמר הבאות ממדינתן, ועניצי פשתן, ולשונות של ארגמן, הרי אלו שלו, דברי רבי מאיר.
These found items belong to him. If one found scattered produce, scattered coins, bundles of grain in the public area, round cakes of pressed figs, baker's loaves, strings of fish, cuts of meat, wool fleeces that are taken from their state of origin directly after shearing, bound flax stalks, or bound strips of comb purple wool, these belong to him. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir.
ואלו חייב להכריז. מצא פירות בכלי או כלי כמות שהוא, מעות בכיס או כיס כמות שהוא, ציבורי פירות, ציבורי מעות, 3 מטבעות זה על גב זה, כריכות ברשות היחיד, וכיכרות של בעל הבית, וגזעי צמר הלקוחות מבית האומן, כדי יין וכדי שמן, הרי אלו חייב להכריז.
And for these found items, one is obligated to proclaim his find. If it's inside a vessel or a vessel by itself, coins inside a pouch or a pouch by itself, piles of produce, piles of coins, 3 coins stacked one atop another, bundles of grain in a secluded area, loaves of a homemaker, a homeowner, wool fleeces that are taken from the house of a craftsman, jugs of wine or jugs of oil. This he's obligated to proclaim his find. So, as I said, I'll give you a few minutes, just first impressions of what changed between the prescription of Hashavat Aveda in the Bible, in the Torah, and the prescription of Hashavat Aveda here in the Mishnah.
So someone is pointing out that the last word of this Mishnah is from the Greek. So we have an advanced, they want to know what happened to the animals, that instead of being focused on...
So here's what I want to know. The person, is the word that we didn't put here, right? Which word they're talking about? The emporia, because there is a word in Greek at the end of Mishnah 1, but we left out because we wouldn't have time to explore.
So Sean, if you want to elaborate on your Greek answer, let me know. People are pointing out there's much more detail. And instead of being focused on animals, our livestock, this is focused on products, and things that we think of as being almost, commercial ventures. And many of these are not raw materials. They've been developed and established. Some items are scattered and can be kept, but items inside of objects seem to belong to someone else, so they need to be stated, that it's not just about the purse, but what's in the purse. And I think there is some general questions, for those of us who are less familiar with the Mishnah. This seems very granular. This is very specific. Is that typical of the Mishnah?
Yes. I mean, so Professor Jacob Neusner, there are many theories about the nature of the Mishnah. As many other ancient texts, there is no introduction, right? It's attributed to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, but even that has been questioned, but there is no introduction of purpose. So there is a debate whether this was meant to be a legal code. Professor Jacob Neusner see in this text more a philosophical text, and passages such as this of lists. The Mishnah is full of lists, and he associates to Aristotle, right? Who also like to qualify and classify things, right? So this is something that shows up a lot in the Mishnah, lists, exemplary lists.
In one person, going back to Miriam's points about the pronouns, the possessive suffixes, here instead of those we have the word shall. And also in answer to the Greek question, it's lechik rees.
Okay.
In fact, yeah. That actually does exist in Aramaic and appears once in, I think at least once in the book of Daniel in Aramaic. The root, I mean, but indeed the verb, and as are all the verbs from this root, do come are new in Hebrew in the Mishnaic period. Basically, there is in that time between the canonization of the Bible and between the Mishnah, we've had nothing short of a revolution in the Hebrew language.
So I want to make just a quick observation or comment on people's what people pay attention to, and give, because of timing, give Miriam the microphone. But one of the things that I don't know, Ellie, maybe it's commented upon, is that now the Mishnah contemplates the possibility that whoever finds the object might stay with the object, right? And we can
there
imagine.
Are definitely some people pointing out that this idea of keeping an obligation and all of those pieces that were not part of the Torah.
Right. So we can imagine the sociological changes that also are reflected in the list, right? When people said it's not animals, but commercial products, that there is a big shift into urban living, right? Not only a shift into urban living, but now we're living at a time we're part of the Roman Empire, right? So there are building of big cities. Now there are Romans, army moving into the region. So they are probably, the Mishnah said, like, sometimes it's not always gonna be possible, even though in the ideal, right? And in the absolute ideal of Exodus, you should always return. And as Deuteronomy said, Lot to Halitalim, you should never refrain. But now we have to make it practical and pragmatic, right? So we have to make some decisions of what is realistic to return and what it's not realistic to return. And on the other side, right? Deuteronomy just said, like, bring home and wait, right? And now there is, again, a more proactive action that is required from the finder, who has to leachris. Later in this chapter, the Mishnah is going to detail more. What does it mean to announce? What exactly does the person need to announce? But I would say already, for those who are compared the scatter things versus the scatter fruits versus the fruits in a pouch, the scatter coins versus the coins in a pouch, right? The rabbis later in this Mishnah are going to use a term that define this list, right? Especially the first list are things that don't have what they call simanim, identifiable marks. So if Miriam finds a lost object and announces, and Ellie shows up, and Miriam asks, what's the siman? In the first list, it's hard for Ellie to identify. So Ellie shouldn't expect to get this object back. In the second list, Ellie can say, well, it's this pouch that my mom saw. She can give more descriptive elements, and so she's more likely to get that thing back. So this is what is going on. And I want to pass to Miriam to talk about the shell.
No spoiler. So we can go to the next slide. I want to point out two things here. So first of all, in the first, that header there, right? Which found items belong to him? Elo mitziot shelo. So as someone pointed out correctly, indeed, this is not this. In the Bible, this would be mitziotav, right? His findings would be indicated with a possessive suffix. Here, this is actually not a possessive suffix anymore. It literally means these are finds or findings that are to him. All right, so that belong to him. She, that, and lo, to him. Right? And indeed, that's the origin of the word shell, which then becomes, very common to indicate possession. That is one point that we will touch upon a little bit later. But I want you to notice this color coding here. What I did is I put in purple all of the nouns, and in green the descriptors. So these are sometimes adjectives or participles in the role of adjective, or they can be adverbials like birshut harabim in a public area, right? And sometimes even by who they belong to, as we see, not someone specific here, but more like of a baker versus home owner.
And not who they belong, but who produced them.
Who produced them, exactly. Exactly. Originating in the, thank you for that. But there is a lot of descriptive detail here. So the focus here, as Luciana said, the focus here shifts from what we saw in from the owner of the object in the Torah to characteristics that belong to the object, that are inherent to the objects themselves, regardless of who owns them, right? So now it's almost like they now have it's very visual, it's very specific. When teaching this, actually, I like to ask students to read this themselves out loud, because it's actually hard to read such a long list. It makes you aware of how detailed it is. It's very, very descriptive. And as Luciana said, only the owner in the second, for the found items that he has to profane, the owner will be able to describe that object and thus prove ownership. So that's the other thing. And we can go to the next slide. The other thing is now the owner is no longer the ownership is no longer assumed. Now, one quick thing to point out, because we don't have that much time, but I do want to point out quickly. action nouns, aka gerunds. They can both indicate, this is both in the Torah and in the Mishnah, they can indicate the action as well as the result of an action. So avad became lost, right? And we have here in Deuteronomy, we had avedat achicha asher tovad mimenu, that would be lost to him, right? Or that he would lose. But it's really the subject here is the aveda, the loss itself, the lost object. So the aveda, it is the action of losing something, and it's also the result of that action that is, a lost item or object. And then in the Mishnah, we move from the aveda, so somebody lost something, still belongs to him, right? But he lost it, to the mitzvah. So now the focus really shifts to the finding, right? Grammatically, this is similar, right? We have he found, and then batzah. So he finds it, and then the action is mitzvah, the action of finding something, and it's also a find. You have this in English as well, right? If you meet, the action is we're having a meeting, we are meeting, but we also the result is a meeting. Right? So this doesn't work for all words, but it works here. What's important here is this shift from the loser to the finder. There was a question. Do we take that?
No, I think we have to move forward. And
right.
then
let's go to the next, right. The next, okay, so this is basically what I just said, right? This shift to the finding and to the objects being defined by their inherent descriptor or characteristics opens the possibility for new ownership. So new ownership is no longer fixed. It's almost like, now the object has kind of like this ontological status of its own and now can be reattached to somebody else, right? And next slide, Luciana.
Great. So trying to summarize very, very quickly and to come to some conclusion. So as we saw, there is already between Shemot, between Exodus and Deuteronomy, there is already a progression, a transformation, but using the Hashavat Avedah, this commandment to create ties, social ties, right, to create a social fabric and to expand that social fabric, that is in some ways happening also in the Mishnah, because the Mishnah fully developed those 3 passages in Deuteronomy into a full chapter. However, as Miriam has noticed, right, the object now is unstable. The possession, the ownership is unstable. If in the Torah, ownership was taken for granted, so it doesn't matter, even if you lost your object, it's always yours. The shar, it's always of the oyev or always of the chavet, even if the person who found doesn't know who that person is, but it never changes, right? Now, as Miriam described, this ontological, independent characteristics of the object indicate that the relationship between the owner and the object is now unstable, right? And you will have to rely, proof of ownership will have to rely on the ability of the original owner to give the simanim, to give the identification marks of the owner himself, right? And as I said, on the one hand, there are probably, again, sociological reasons, right? Moving into urban areas, also influence of Roman legal codes that also have, by this time, a much more developed civil law. But I want to shift a little bit into a kind of more symbolic reading of those laws. So the next slide brings this idea by Chaim Steinman that whenever we read rabbinic texts, right, on the one hand, we're thinking about laws and commandments and how we are supposed to obey them and fulfill them. But on the other hand, we are constantly aware that the rabbis are using law as a discourse, right? This is their primary discourse to talk about things that philosophers talk about, that political theorists talk about, the theologians talk about, right? The rabbis don't talk in that conceptual language, but they use law as an indicator that something else is going on besides the simple fulfillment of this immediate obligation. So this shift, right, and this destabilization of ownership has been noticed by scholars and have been noticed and has been interpreted as also an indicative of a theological message. So if we move to the next slide, and if we think about the period that the rabbis are living, right, everything they knew cannot be taken for granted anymore, right? Their identity, their social structures, their political structures, right? So all of a sudden, this law of lost objects stands for, becomes a symbol for all these other losses that they have gone through, right? And this shift into a property, an ownership that you take for granted, such as the ownership of your relationship with God, your relationship with Torah, or your identity, they're also being put to question, right? And in order to reappropriate ourselves of that, we're going to have to reinterpret, look again at those, at Torah, at God, and land, and all those things. And just as we do with the objects and interpret, trying to ascertain to whom it belongs, reinterpret if we want to reestablish our ownership of them. So I want to finish with the quote by Professor Marjorie Lederman, the head of our Talmud department, who says exactly what I was indicated. So the material object is now transformed into a symbol for other types of unrecovered losses. Loss is far more significant than the material object. Concern for material loss is merely the foundation for a larger and more significant discussion about loss in general. The loss of the authority of the Torah, the loss of prophecy, the loss of the temple, the loss of honesty, the loss of Jewish community, and the loss of the rabbinic authority. And with that, Ellie, how did we do with the time? Forget it.
We're good. Let's just go with we're fine.
Okay.
Miriam, I'm going to go ahead and pin you here too, so we have you for our Q&A here. We're gonna only take a couple of questions just because we are running low on time. But I think one person pointed out in the chat that this is later refined. This idea of lost objects is refined in even more detail, particularly in thinking about the despair that one feels after losing an object, and that indicates your feeling about an object indicates whether it is lost or not.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, again, we have, because of our short time, right? When it comes to Nishma, we don't stop at the Mishnah, but we move forward in the Babylonian Talmud, and sometimes we compare with the Palestinian, the Yerushalmi Talmud. So, and we see how that develops and what other ideologies that are taking into consideration.
So it really is giving people, like, we had a very bite-sized taste of what that kind of learning is, but this is really developing not just the kind of skill to do this, but also the thinking around, the kind of broader critical thinking skills as well, that you need both to support this kind of learning. I would like to, in kind of switching gears, I know we were featuring kind of Nishma learning. Can you give us kind of a preview of what Tanakh 360 looks like too, since we're here and we have people who might be interested, and this is a good kind of audience for it?
So Nishma is an intense commitment, right? The Nishma program runs for 5 weeks, and people have to commit for the full 5 weeks in order to, right? It takes a while to get into this mode of patient reading and to listen to the voice of the text. It's almost like a meditative practice. So it takes a while, and we understand that not everybody has the time, right, and the possibility of spending those 5 weeks. So we created a program that gives more flexibility, and instead of focusing only on rabbinic literature, it focused on different readings of the Tanakh, right? So the full program also runs for 5 weeks, but people can join for a single week or for 2 weeks or for 3 weeks. So each week is independent of each other. And during each week, we're going to focus on the liturgical reading of the week, on the parasha, on the weekly parasha that is read in synagogues. And on Monday, you're going to have an opportunity to study with, for instance, Professor Ben Summer, and through the lenses of biblical scholarship, read the text. Then on Tuesday, you're going to have an opportunity to learn with Professor Itz Landis and dive into the tools that the rabbis have used to read the Bible. And then on Wednesday, you're going to have an opportunity to study with Professor Rabbi Harris and consider what do the Parshanim, the medieval readers of text, were looking for, what kind of clues they were looking for in order to create meaning. And then when Thursday, you're going to have an opportunity to learn with someone like Professor Shira Billet and ask about like what philosophers in the 18th, 19th century, what big concepts do they draw out of those biblical passages. So this is just one sample. Each week you're going to have an opportunity to learn with different biblical scholars, with different scholars of rabbinic literature and of medieval Parshanut and so forth.
I think it's such an exciting, for those of us who are summer camp kids, that this is, if you're looking for a summer camp in New York where you spend your mornings in deep, really intensive study, and then your afternoons you can go do what you want to do, or you could study Hebrew with Miriam and others at JTS. What? Maybe not Miriam, but people with Miriam in her universe. So thank you guys. Thank you both so much for sharing with us today. This has been a delightful session, and I really appreciate your ability to kind of balance a bunch of things in a short time. As one of our participants pointed out, that this is a lesson about dialogue within texts that was presented as a dialogue, and then that in and of itself was giving kind of an illustration of the challenge of engaging with text. Our next session, this session was looking way back. Our next section is looking forward, but still focused on text. We'll be hearing from Rabbi Stephanie Ruskay and Dr. Phil Kissman about 2 programs that we have for teens and the ways that they're using kind of learning Jewish text and learning to engage this next generation of leaders and doers and thinkers. So thank you guys so much for joining us this week, and we'll see you next week with our webinar.
Thank you.